Hi, my name's Dwayne. I'm a child of God. I struggle with sexual addiction, sexual anorexia, and codependency. So, one of the things at Celebrate Recovery we do in our small groups is we have some guidelines, and those guidelines are what we use to keep the group safe and effective. In each one of our small groups, we have a leader who is a facilitator who makes sure that the guidelines are followed and who intercedes whenever they're not followed. As part of the process in our small groups, whether it be an open share group or a step study group, we read the small group guidelines. And when we say read the small group guidelines, we don't just mean read them. Sometimes there might be additional content that occurs during the process of reading the small group guidelines. So usually in our guidelines, we'll have a handout, and that handout will have the 5 guidelines that we normally have, plus maybe some explanatory text that elaborates on the guidelines. Typically, the guidelines themselves are in bold print, and then the rest is in normal font. And so what might happen in a typical small group is every single week, no matter what, without fail, all of the bold print will be read, but the non-bold print on the handout might only be read occasionally. Perhaps if there's a new person in the group, or perhaps once a month in order to refresh everybody's memory or to mix it up. But those are not the only 2 things that might happen. For any given guideline, the leader who facilitates the group will definitely read the guideline, might read the additional explanatory text, and might also provide their own examples of what following that guideline might look like or breaking that guideline might look like. And they may also, in fact, I would encourage them to let the participants know how they will interrupt if that guideline is violated. It's very important to realize that the whole point of having the guidelines is that they be followed. And the best way to go about enforcing or ensuring that the guidelines are followed is when they are broken, to interrupt. That's probably a topic for another day, but in this video, I'm going to give a demo of what it might look like if a leader read the guidelines fully and also told how they were going to interrupt for each guideline. So this whole content might not be done every single week. In fact, there might be weeks when only the bold print is read. But frequently, it is very valuable and very important that the leader elaborate on a particular guideline, perhaps because there's new people in the group, or perhaps because there were many people last week that violated that guideline, or it just feels like people are not understanding it. And it's just very valuable to cover it in enough detail so that people don't become complacent or become unfamiliar with the guidelines, because we really believe what keeps our group safe is by each person voluntarily submitting to the guidelines, and then when they accidentally violate a guideline, to voluntarily submit to the leader's guidance in getting back on track. So here's an example of me reading the guidelines in a group. Number 1, keep your sharing focused on your own thoughts and feelings, not your spouse's, someone you're dating, or your family members' hurts and hangups, but your own. Focusing on yourself will benefit your recovery as well as the ones around you. Stick to I or me statements, not you or we statements. Limit your sharing to 3 to 5 minutes so that everyone has an opportunity to share, and to ensure that one person does not dominate the group sharing time. So if somebody in the group starts using the word you, they say, you know how you are when you're tempted, or you know how it is, and that sort of thing, I will interrupt and say, please use I or me statements. Or if someone starts talking about someone other than themselves, perhaps their spouse or their boss or their kid or their parents, and they say, my parents said blah, 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 or my wife did yakety yak. As soon as I hear some content about what they did or said, I will interrupt immediately and say, please focus on your own thoughts and feelings. So the way to look at focusing on your own thoughts and feelings is to not share any information about anyone other than myself. Now, it's okay to refer to my spouse and say, my spouse did something and I lost my temper. But it doesn't really matter if my spouse did something good or bad, whether my spouse called me blessed or less than blessed, whether they did what I asked to or didn't do what I asked them to. All that really matters is how I reacted. Now, it's okay that I reference my spouse because it's reasonable to expect that sometimes I'm going to be triggered by other people, but I don't need to give any information about my spouse. There's three reasons for that. One reason is that my spouse did not sign up to come to this group. And so if I am talking about her, I'm breaking her confidentiality, and that's not what we're all about. The second reason is that whenever I start talking about someone else, let's say my boss, I start harboring a sort of a harshness or an anger or resentment to them rather than working on my own stuff. I might be building up that anger or resentment to take out on them later. And I'm trying to get other people in the room to kind of feel my pain and join my fight against this other person. So really, I'm actually making my situation, my emotional state worse by talking about somebody else. And then the third reason is that the whole point of coming to group is for me to work on me. And so let's say I got 5 minutes to share, but I spend 3 minutes talking about somebody who's not in the room. That means I've given up 3 of my 5 minutes to work on me for nothing. And so I'm really wasting my recovery time by talking about other people. So that's why we use the guidelines to help people learn how to be effective in their recovery while also learning to protect other people's confidentiality, just like they would want their confidentiality to be respected. And so if I say stick to I or me statements, or you or we statements, or please focus on your own thoughts and feelings, realize that I have learned something about someone other than you that I shouldn't need to know. Or I'm feeling like you're pointing a finger at other people in the group by using you or we statements rather than focusing on your own stuff. Now, as far as the time limit, I'm going to watch the clock, and I keep a watch on my hand and I watch it. And let's say we've got 5 minutes each as we go around the circle. When you have 1 minute left, I'm going to hold up a finger that means 1 minute left. Now, if you don't see me hold up a finger, then I'm going to say 1 minute left, or usually I'll just say 1 minute. And that lets you know that you've got 1 minute left of sharing. Now, when your sharing time is done, I'm going to say, thanks for sharing. And what that means is your time is up and we're ready for the next person to have a chance. Now, that doesn't mean I don't want to hear more about your story. It means that that's going to have to wait until outside of group, maybe fellowship outside of group or in a phone call later in the week. But we want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to share. And even if we only have 2 people, 3 people, 4 people in the group, we're going to limit the sharing to 5 minutes each time we go around the circle so that we can all learn how to share concisely and effectively within the 3 to 5 minutes for those times when there are 12 people in the group and time constraints really do matter. Number 2, there is no crosstalk. Crosstalk is when 2 people engage in a conversation, excluding all others. Each person is free to express his or her feelings without interruption. Crosstalk is also making distracting comments or questions while someone is sharing. This includes speaking to another member of the group while someone is sharing, or responding to what someone has shared during his or her time of sharing. So basically, crosstalk is anything that would interrupt the person who is sharing. So that could be a lot of different things. It could even be clicking a pen if I have one of those noisy pens because that's distracting. It could be crumpling some paper. It could be looking at an electronic device. And so that's why in our groups, we don't allow looking at electronic devices because other people can't tell if I'm listening, if I'm looking at my tablet or my phone. They don't know that I'm not reading email or getting a text or doing any number of things. And so we don't allow electronic devices. Anything like that could be interrupted, and I could say, no crosstalk, please. Basically, anything that interrupts is considered crosstalk, even if there's no talking involved. So body motion can be that way. If I'm over here doing this all the time, that's going to be considered crosstalk. So anything that's disruptive. Similarly, maybe someone in my group has a job which requires them to have a phone on them all the time, and they may have to actually leave in the middle of group. Now, if they leave to take a phone call and come back in, that would be a kind of crosstalk. But if they have to leave because they get an emergency phone call, we ask that they take their stuff with them, leave, and not come back. That's the way they can be minimally invasive into the sharing process, but still keep their commitments that they can't avoid outside of group. Number 3, we're here to support one another, not fix one another. This keeps us focused on our own issues. We do not give advice or solve someone's problems in our time of sharing or offer book referrals or counselor referrals. We are not licensed counselors, psychologists, or therapists, nor are the group members. Celebrate Recovery groups are not designed for this. It is up to the participants to include outside counseling to their program when they are ready. So this is very important, and this is the guideline in which I normally remind people that our guidelines apply outside of the small group. Because let's say that I really desperately want to give somebody advice while I'm in small group, but I know that I'm not going to be allowed to do that. So I make a note. And then as soon as we walk outside the small group into the hall, I go, hi, Bob, I've got some advice for you. Well, let's think about what is the point of having the guidelines. The point of having the guidelines is so that our groups are safe. Now, it makes no sense if our small groups are safe, but our hall outside the group is not safe. It makes no sense if our small group is safe, but our fellowships beforehand and after are not safe. It makes no sense if our small groups are safe, but our get-togethers one-on-one during the week or our phone calls during the week are unsafe. So that's what we mean when we say that the guidelines mostly apply outside of group as much, sometimes even more, than they apply inside group. Now, inside group fixing might look like this. If Fred shares, and it's his turn to share, and he shares about how he struggled with tiddlywinks, well, then we go around the circle and Bob has to share, and Bob says, well, when I struggled with tiddlywinks, what I did was blah, blah, blah. That's an example of Bob trying to fix Fred, because Bob's not really sharing about where he's at this week. He's trying to take his experience and direct it towards Bob. So if somebody looks like they're sharing in a way that might be aimed at another person in the group, we're going to call that fixing. And I'm going to interrupt and say, no fixing, please. Or I might say, no giving advice. Now, it's very important that we keep in mind what fixing looks like. Fixing might look like a lot of things here. Recommending a book, recommending a counselor, recommending something my pastor said, or my sponsor said, or somebody else said. Those are all ways of giving advice, and we don't do that. Not only do we not do it in group, because that would interrupt, but we don't do it at all because it undermines safety. Now, I may ask, well, how do people figure out what to do? Well, people figure it out by coming to group regularly and observing other people in the group and seeing what they do. They also learn by making phone calls during the week and talking to people and hearing what other people are doing. And so what we're doing is we're providing a safe environment for people to meet other people who are struggling, who are trying new things, who are succeeding, and sometimes failing. And they're able to pick ideas up from other people by being observational rather than by being receivers of advice or being told what to do. It's very important that we learn not to fix or give advice. That's also a very important part of working on my codependency, where I think that I know the answer for everybody else, but not only that, that I know when they need the answer. And that's right now when I think they need the answer. Guideline number 4 says anonymity and confidentiality are basic requirements. What's shared in the group stays in the group. The only exception is when someone threatens to injure themselves or others. Texas law requires the abuse of children, the elderly, or disabled adults to be reported to Child Protective Services, CPS, or Adult Protective Services, APS. We are not to share information with our spouses, family, co-workers. This also means not discussing what is shared in the group among group members. This is called gossip. Please be advised, if anyone threatens to hurt themselves or others, the small group leader has the responsibility to report it to the Celebrate Recovery Ministry leader. Now, in this guideline, we at HCBC-CR have actually added a piece. Now, we don't normally add to the guidelines or change the guidelines because it's very important that the CR model is followed at our CR just like it should be. However, we've made an exception in this case based on the advice of the advanced leader training that comes from CR. In that advanced leader training, it talks about how to deal with legal issues related to anonymity and confidentiality. There are certain things that are required in certain states to be reported. And so what we've chosen to do is we've added a phrase in to let people know what the law says so that they are aware of what has to be reported before they confess certain things. So in Texas in particular, it does require the abuse of children, the elderly, or disabled adults to be reported. We don't want to be guilty of entrapment, so we want people to know ahead of time that that will be reported because it is a legal requirement. A lot of times people think that their speech is protected, maybe if they talk to a pastor or a priest or an accountant or a doctor or a lawyer. But the fact of the matter, in many states, in our case, Texas, we have elevated the protection of children, the elderly, and disabled adults above other protections. And so it is not true that my lawyer, my accountant, my pastor, my priest, or my doctor won't report me if I confess I've abused a child, an elderly person, or a disabled adult, because they know they're legally required to report that, and we want people to be knowledgeable of what the law says. Now, generally speaking, in group, we don't have to interrupt often on anonymity and confidentiality, because most of the time, if somebody's breaking anonymity or confidentiality, they're breaking someone else's, so they're talking about someone else. So normally they're going to get interrupted by me saying, please use I or me statements, or please focus on your own thoughts and feelings. Now, in our groups, we require people to only share their first name and last initial. So perhaps if they share their last name, I could interrupt and say, first names only, please. Number 5, offensive language has no place in a Christ-centered recovery group. Therefore, we ask that you please watch your language. The main issue here is that the Lord's name is not used inappropriately. We also avoid graphic descriptions. If anyone feels uncomfortable with how explicitly a speaker is sharing regarding his/her behaviors, then you may indicate so by simply raising your hand. The speaker will then respect your boundaries by being less specific in his/her descriptions. This will avoid potential triggers that could cause a person to act out. So first of all, let's talk about what offensive language means. It doesn't just mean curse words. It might also mean grouping people. You know how that ethnic group is, or you know how men are, or you know how women are. That's also offensive language. And so I might interrupt and say, no categorizing, please, or that's offensive. Please use other language. We definitely want people to not use the Lord's name in vain, but I usually let people know, I'm not going to kick you out for a dirty word, but I'm going to ask you to clean it up. Now, if someone is a repeat offender, then I might tell them that they have to change the way they speak or they can't come to our group. Now, as far as graphic descriptions, I'll use myself as an example. I struggle with sexual addiction. Now, that might mean that I need to confess how I did this week. Now, I could come in and say, I acted out this week, but I didn't really confess very much, not in any detail, not with any clarity. And so it really matters how I acted out. What did I do? How often did I do it? For how long did I do it? The more I confess clearly, the more I'm going to get healing and I'm going to experience community with other people. But we don't want to share in such a way that it paints a picture and tempts someone else in the room sharing the same struggle. So, for example, I might need to say that I struggled with lust or fantasy or masturbation or looking at pornography or having sex with somebody other than my spouse or having a prostitute. We would not consider that to be too much information. That would be properly sharing what I did. I might say that I looked at pornography 3 times this week or for 3 hours on Saturday. That would not be too much information. But I'm not going to tell what kind of pornography. I'm not going to paint a picture. I'm also not going to refer to things that other people might be familiar with. I'm not going to refer to a particular type of social media or a website or a TV show or a movie or some famous person or some place at the corner of this street and that street, because I don't want to give new ideas to other people in the room who struggle with the same thing, and I don't want to trigger people who are trying to not think of certain things. Now, in the example of alcohol, I might say I had a 6-pack of beer this week, or I had a bottle of wine, or I had a fifth of vodka. And that might not be too much information, but I'm not going to give a brand name. I'm not going to tell what bar I went to. I'm not going to give anything that's going to give more information than necessary or help others paint a picture. So that's what we mean when we talk about graphic description. So I might interrupt and I might say, please use less detail. Now, these guidelines are all the guidelines that we use in a normal season at Celebrate Recovery. Right now, in the midst of COVID-19, because we're allowing through CR online open share groups, we have some additional guidelines that I'm going to review real quickly. Number 6, all members must use headphones. This will ensure that no one else can overhear what is shared in the group. So it's important that although I might not care if other people in the house hear what I struggle with, I don't have the right to let anybody in the house hear what the people on my online open share group struggle with. So I have to use headphones all the time. That might be earbuds, it might be Bluetooth earbuds, it might be total coverage, but something that allows me to hear but no one else to hear. Number 7, all members must be on camera. If the group leader asks, they must show the rest of the group that no one else is in the room. So that's very important. We don't allow people to call in just with voice. Now that's more limiting, but that's what we chose to do to make sure our groups are safe. Each person needs to be in a room by themselves, not with anybody else, and there needs to be nobody off camera who can hear, but nobody knows is in the group. And so I might ask you to look and show me where you're at, and you might be able to turn around and show everybody in the room. I'm not going to spin around 360 degrees because I'm afraid I might drop my computer, but you get the idea. And so it's very important that we respect the confidentiality and anonymity of the people in our group by following these guidelines. The last one is these meetings will not be recorded. Now, there's 2 aspects to that. We use software called Zoom for our online open shares, and we have it set to where it's not recording and it prevents anyone else from recording on their end in Zoom. But we're also talking about nobody can bring in a camera and like point it at the screen and record. So if somebody were to do that, then we would remove them from the group. And so I hope this makes it clear what it looks like to cover the guidelines. Now, again, everything I said will not be covered. And sometimes I might give examples rather than just talk about how I'm going to interrupt. So there's lots of different ways that a leader might handle reading the guidelines, but seldom is it going to just be reading the bold print. There's usually going to be more to it. And as a leader tells that they're going to interrupt and how they're going to interrupt, don't be surprised because they are going to interrupt. And they do it out of love for you. They're choosing to give up their comfort zone to make sure the group is safe. I hope you have a great week, and we will see you next time. Take care.